This is the second lecture in Module 6, and today we're going to be looking at the American theater in the 20th century, beginning with the end of the 19th, moving up until the latter part of the 20th century. We want to start today by looking at an organization that had a very powerful influence on the professional theater during the earliest days of the 20th century, and this was an organization called the Syndicate, or the Theatrical Syndicate. The Theatrical Syndicate was formed in 1896. Its members included the producer Charles Frohman, A.L. Erlanger and Mark Claw, Samuel Nixon and Fred Zimmerman, and Al Heyman. Now, these theatrical entrepreneurs, or businessmen, created a business organization that controlled the American touring theater for many, many years. These gentlemen were not so much producing theater by themselves or on their own, but were in fact controlling what acts were going into theaters, what productions, what acts toured the country, what theaters they were booked into. Charles Frohman is perhaps the most famous and the most powerful of the members of the syndicate. Frohman had control over many theaters in the United States, on the East and West Coast, even held the lease on theaters in Great Britain. In fact, Frohman was the initial producer of J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. And in fact is depicted in the new musical Finding Neverland. He also died in 1915, coming back from England on the Lusitania, when the Lusitania was sunk, and that of course was one of the factors that led the United States into World War I. Of course, producers who stood up against the Theatrical Syndicate. Some of the most powerful of those were the Schubert Brothers, Sam, Levi, and Jacob Schubert. They broke the backbone of the syndicate by building their own theaters, and therefore they could control what acts, what performances took place in their theaters. The other important figure in the breaking of the syndicate was David Belasco. David Belasco was an American producer and director. He was noted for his star-making power. If he picked a young leading woman to be his star, she would inevitably be a success. He's also noted for his extravagant approach to realism. In one of his plays, he depicted the Delmonico's restaurant, and he went to such great lengths to create a sense of reality that he had the Delmonico's make their entire menu, make meals about everything listed on their menu, and had that brought and served in the play, so that the food that was being eaten by the actors was from Delmonico's restaurant. The other very significant event in the American theater that occurred during this early part of the 20th century was the rise of Actors' Equity. Actors' Equity was initially formed in 1913, but it really didn't come into its own until after the actor strike of 1919. Prior to this, directors could require all kinds of inordinate things of their actors. Actors could be required to pay for their own costumes. Actors could be denied payment during rehearsals, and directors could rehearse and rehearse and rehearse and never have to pay the actors. Actors could be fired with no recourse, with no notice, and there was no health protection. There was no one there taking care of the actor. And so in 1919, the actors on Broadway went on strike. They shut the theaters down. And from that strike, Actors' Equity arose to become the voice of the professional actor. And of course, that has maintained its status through today. There were two other significant developments that occurred in the American theater during this era. First of all was the importance of theater in the educational world. Now, theater had been a part of a liberal arts education since the Renaissance. Theater was used in all kinds of academic settings to teach deportment, to teach dance and movement and rhetorical skills. But there had never been a course of study that focused on theater, made it the source of study. And so that changed in America during this era. Howard Baker began to teach playwriting at Radcliffe College, and then moved on to Harvard, where he continued to teach playwriting, attracted such theater notables as Eugene ONeill, Robert Edmond Jones, Hallie Flanagan. Finally, he moved to Yale and opened the Yale School of Drama, which became the... Other schools were beginning this process as well, and in 1914, Thomas Wood Stevens at the Carnegie Institute of Technology instituted the first theater major in the United States. And so from these programs, Howard Baker at Radcliffe, Harvard, Yale, the development of a theater degree at Carnegie, we begin to see the growth of a training program for American theater artists. The other important factor that occurs during this era is the appearance of the little theater movement in the United States. Now, today, the term little theater is synonymous with amateur or community theater, and they do things like Neil Simon or other comedies. But the little theaters of the early 20th century were a different nature of theater altogether. They were amateur theater groups, but these were different than our contemporary community theater groups. These were groups like the Provincetown Players that were premiering most of Eugene ONeill's work. These were companies that were employing the new stagecraft. If you go back to all those isms we looked at in the first lecture of this unit or module, these were the American theater companies that were experimenting in these new European approaches in scene design, in scenography, in script writing. And so the little theater movement in the United States in the beginning of the 20th century is actually the experimenting ground where the new stagecraft, the new ideas from the European theater are making their appearances on the American stage. One of the most important aspects of these little theaters were their non-commercial aspect. They could afford to be experimental because they weren't trying to make money. They were independent. They were an outgrowth of the European theater, and in many ways they were the birthplace of the off-Broadway theater movement. Several important theaters to come from the little theater movement. One of those was the Washington Square Players. Washington Square Players were a theater that was located in Greenwich Village. They later evolved into the American Theater Guild, a subscription-based professional organization that introduced experimental European and American playwrights. Leading theater of this movement was the Provincetown Playhouse. It was established in Provincetown, Massachusetts in 1915 by vacationing artists who came from New York, Greenwich Village. 1916, they moved the theater to the Greenwich Village Theater, where they dedicated themselves to the production of new drama. And significant within that was their adoption of Eugene ONeill. Eugene ONeill is one of the new generation of American playwrights. He saw art as a high calling, as a special calling. He lived a very painful life. He came from an Irish immigrant family. His father was a well-known actor. His mother was an alcoholic. There was attempted suicide in his family. This is reflected in many of his plays. For instance, Long Day's Journey into Night. Eugene ONeill was the first dramatist to win a Nobel Prize for Literature in 1936, and he wrote different forms of drama. realism, expressionism, modern versions of Greek tragedy, like in Morning Becomes Electra. Eugene ONeill is in many ways the American forerunner or introducer of many of the European movements. I mean, if you look, you can see a clear reflection of expressionism in his work. Many of the characters in his plays are representative characters. They are allegorical figures, like you might find in expressionism. The themes of his plays often deal with the dehumanizing and depersonalization of American society by industrialization and commercialism. And so he is the American embodiment of what we see in many of the European experiments of this era. Other important American playwrights of the same period would include Elmer Rice, author of the first American example of Expressionism, The Adding Machine. Thornton Wilder is doing experimental things with plays like Our Town and The Skin of Our Teeth. Clifford Odets is writing political drama with Awake and Sing, Waiting for Lefty, plays that show a clear Marxist bias. And then you've got playwrights who are doing more traditional and more mainstream things. Lillian Hellman with her realistic play, The Little Foxes, and Kaufman and Hart with comedies like You Can't Take It With You. In the 1920s, the Moscow Art Theater, Stanislavski's company, toured the United States and brought Stanislavski's system of acting instruction, character development approach to a play to American audiences. And this was a very important step in the American theater because the ideas they introduced were startlingly new and fresh for American theaters, and had a lasting impact. A couple of members of the Moscow Art Theater stayed in the United States. Among those, Maria Uspenskaya and Richard Boleslavsky, who both stayed and taught acting. And they had the company also had a great impact on American performers who were looking for new ways of production and approaching theater. One of the most important of these was the Group Theater, founded in 1931. The founding members of the Group Theater were Lee Strasberg, Cheryl Crawford, and Harold Klorman. Their resident playwright was Clifford Odets, and their company included such actors as Franchot Tone, Morris Karnofsky, Stella Adler, Luther Adler, and John Garfield. They were the America's introduction to the teachings of Stanislavski. They began to explore socially relevant, politically relevant plays. The company was disbanded in 1941, but their influence was long-lasting because many of the members of the Group Theater then went on to other theater endeavors, but they continued to stress the importance of the Stanislavski acting system. One of the most significant events in America's 20th century history takes place in 1929 when the American stock market crashes. And the reverberations of that catastrophe are felt throughout the country. And obviously that is going to be felt in the theater industry. Theater is seen by many as a recreational activity, as a very elective kind of activity. You do it after you've paid your bills and fed your family. And so the lack of money to go see the theater means that theaters begin to cut back. And so the actors are having the same financial crisis the rest of the country faces. And so the government stepped in and created the Federal Theater Project to provide economic employment opportunities for America's actors. In 1935, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt instituted the Works Progress Administration, and part of the Works Progress Administration was the Federal Theater Project. Now, this project was under the direction of Hallie Flanagan. Hallie Flanagan had studied with Howard Baker at the Yale School of Drama and was one of the leading factors or leading forces in the American theater. The Federal Theater Project had branches all across the United States. They were presenting classic theater like Macbeth, produced by Orson Welles. They had African American theater projects. They had other types of theater projects. Perhaps one of the most influential and innovative things that was being done by the Federal Theater Project was the living newspaper. The living newspapers were very topical, variety types of performances. Again, hearkening back to the Futurists and Marinetti, but it was variety programs that examined issues facing the country. 1/3 of a Nation was an examination of the housing crisis in America. There was another one called AAA Plowed Under. There was one called Power that looked at the TVA authority. There was even one called Spirochete that looked at the problems of sexually transmitted diseases. The law that required that people get blood tests prior to marriage was a product of a response to the living newspapers of the Federal Theater Project. One of the distinctly American theater forms that came out of the post-war era in America is what is called selective realism. And selective realism is simply what it says it is. It's realism, but it's very selective. It only shows us what needs to be there. For example, in Joe Milziner's production or design for Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, one of the scenes takes place in the kitchen. But the kitchen, all that's needed in the set is the refrigerator and a table. Now, if you go to any American kitchen in the country, you're going to find more than just a refrigerator and a table. But this is selective realism. We are showing a slice of realism, but we're only showing what is required to tell the story. And so selective realism becomes one of the trademarks of the post-war American theater. One of the leading proponents of selective realism is the American playwright Arthur Miller. Such plays as All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, which is considered by many to be one of the greatest plays in the American library, The Crucible, one of my personal favorites, View from the Bridge, and After the Fall. Death of a Salesman is widely considered to be Arthur Miller's best play. It's often also widely considered one of the greatest American plays of all time. It focuses on the falseness of the American dream. Willie Loman is a traveling salesman who is bought into the image of commercial success as a salesman, but who lives in a world that is telling him that he has become obsolete. And the crux of the play is how Loman faces this obsolescence, how he accepts his own diminishment. Miller said of Death of a Salesman, "I believe that the common man is as apt a subject for tragedy in its highest sense as kings were. The tragic feeling is evoked in us when we are in the presence of a character who is ready to lay down his life, if need be, to secure one thing, his sense of personal dignity. Tragedy, then, is the consequence of a man or woman's total compulsion to evaluate himself justly." The other great playwright of the American selective realists is Thomas Lanier Williams, better known as Tennessee Williams, who is obviously the focus of this unit because of our reading of Suddenly Last Summer. Williams was of Southern extraction, but grew up in Middle America, St. Louis. you can get a large understanding of his life by reading or watching the play Glass Menagerie, because it is so autobiographical. He dealt with issues including his overbearing mother, his emotionally crippled sister, his absent father, just like Tom does in Glass Menagerie. Tennessee Williams writes plays that focus on the plight of society's outcasts or outsiders trapped in a hostile environment. Characters like Tom, characters like Brick, Maggie, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. His characters are usually victims or perceive themselves as victims, like Blanche in A Streetcar Named Desire. They are characters trying to come to grips with a harsh reality that is unnatural for them, that is unknown to them. But he creates compassion for these characters through his use of lyrical and poetic language and symbolism. Symbolism like the glass menagerie and the glass animals that represents Laura. Williams was a very prolific playwright and wrote one-acts as well as full-length dramas and even short stories. His most well-known full-length plays include The Glass Menagerie, Streetcar Named Desire, Summer and Smoke, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Sweet Bird of Youth, Night of the Iguana, and Small Craft Warnings. In the 60s, the United States went through a period of rebellion, of questioning, of experimentation in all aspects of culture, and that touched the theater as well. One of the most creative theatrical experiences of that time are what are called the happenings. Happenings were non-structured events that occurred with a minimum of planning and organization. In other words, they were kind of what flash mobs are supposed to be like, but we all know flash mobs are rehearsed. The art was not restricted to museums, galleries, or concert halls. Happenings was about art taking place anywhere, on the street corner, in a shop, in any place people gather. They usually only occurred once. They were usually improvisational and very audience interactive. And as such, they were the foundations of modern performance art. The earliest happenings was entitled 18 Happenings in 6 Parts by Alan Capro. This actually happened in 1959, and so it's one of the early happenings. Here's a description of it. Space was divided into 3 rooms with clear plastic walls. The visitors, whose tickets directed them to specified seats in each room at particular times and with strictly choreographed movements, witnessed, among other events, a girl squeezing oranges, an artist lighting matches and painting, and an orchestra of toy instruments. Although tightly scripted and planned, Capro's early happenings maintained an air of unstructured spontaneity. This was because they had none of the usual trappings of the theater. Not dialogue, character, or professional performers, and no resemblance to the traditional visual arts. Another aspect of the 60s in experimental art is what is called environmental theater. Now, this was first established by the theater critic, producer, director Richard Schechner. Environmental theater was based on the idea that the entire theater space is performance space, that there is no separate area set aside for the audience and a separate area set aside for the performers. And so everything was mingled together. It encouraged improvisation and reworking of the text and was heavily influenced by Jerzy Grotowski and the Poor Theater from Poland. One of the most important, one of the earliest experimental theater companies in the United States was the Living Theater, founded in 1947 by Judith Malina and her husband Julian Beck. The statement of the Living Theater is to call into question who we are to each other in the social environment of the theater, to undo the knots that lead to misery, to spread ourselves across the public's table like platters at a banquet, to set ourselves in motion like a vortex that pulls the spectator into action, to fire the body's secret engines, to pass through the prism and come out a rainbow, to insist that what happens in the jails matters, to cry "not in my name" at the hour of execution, to move from the theater to the street and from the street to the theater. This is what the living theater does today. It is what it has always done. Beck and Molina ran the Living Theater together until Beck's death in 1985. Molina continued to be co-director with other members of the company until her death in 2015. At that point, the company took an anarchic approach, and now there is no director. They direct themselves. I don't know how that works, but that's what they're doing. Obviously, any study of American theater history is going to be an open-ended study because our theater is still developing. The history of our theater is still growing. This brings us up to up through the experimental era of the 60s and the 70s, and of course with the Living Theater on up into 2015 when it went to its anarchic management. We are now more of a commercial enterprise in theater. Our theaters seek first to make money, but luckily there's still some great art being created along the way. If you want to know more about what's going on in the American theater, there's some great PowerPoints posted on the website that Mike put up in a previous semester, but they are there as well for you to look at this semester. I'm looking forward to reading what you guys have to say about Suddenly Last Summer and the other questions on the discussion board. Have a great week. Bye.